Director of Strategy at the Green Web Foundation. I just joined the organization after being at the Mozilla Foundation for 12 years and wanted to share a little bit the work that we've been doing around the idea of a fossil-free internet and how that connects to green coding and practical ways you can integrate these concepts into your work. So why does it all matter? I'm sure you're very grounded in the fact that we're living in a climate crisis. One of the things I found very compelling is to talk about this not being a single issue, that we can focus on this or that, and there's the climate, but rather this is an entire era that we're going to be living in now and for the rest of our lives and generations to come. And I think when you're trying to make arguments in your organizations around why we should care, it's just going to be with us for a very long time. So we also know the IPCC reports and the kind of general scientific consensus that we need rapid and urgent action. That includes in all sectors, especially the IT sector, which we'll see is responsible for quite a lot of emissions. So here we go. At the Green Web Foundation, we like to talk about the internet as being the world's largest coal-powered machine. Often we don't really see the materiality of the internet. We don't really think about how it's powered. But when you actually think about that in aggregate, it's the largest coal-powered machine we have. The IEA, which is probably one of the most conservative but well-known places to look at the data around how much the internet is emitting and the kind of electricity demand around that, it's estimated that the internet contributes around 2 to 3% of the world's carbon annually. A lot of that is coming from the electricity demand in data centers. Just to start to name what that starts to look like. Oops, thought I skipped one. But to give that, if you're kind of how much is 2 or 3%, is it small, is that big? That's more than the aviation industry, more than the shipping industry. So this is a really significant source of emissions worldwide. And I think as technologists, we always need to remember that when we talk about the internet, there are the raw materials, the natural resources, the electricity, the land, and the labor that go into making these systems work. And oftentimes, technology is very good at abstracting those things away. And how can we make those more visible so that we can change them and shift them? You might also be aware of the issues we have around the internet in general, where power is being consolidated around a handful of companies. So we talk about it being the internet being a brittle monoculture. If you look at where the top largest companies are in the world by money, the top companies are either tech companies or fossil fuel companies, with one exception, I think. So when we also talk about where's their power located in these systems, we have to also name the fact that the large control that tech companies have, the major tech companies have on these internet infrastructures. Also, interestingly, the major tech companies are becoming the largest owners of corporate renewable energy. So they're becoming not only huge brokers of internet infrastructures, but also energy infrastructures. So we technologists are, in our work, often enabling this destructive default. And we actually have maybe a duty or a responsibility to challenge and reset those defaults to a more sustainable and just future. So, but how? What can we do? I really appreciate there's a lot of ways to enter this conversation, so I'm just going to share some models that we've been using. One thing is actually, technologies, we've been talking a lot about energy, and actually we should be talking about power. By this I also mean political power, economic power, social power. We also see a lot of technologists really just looking at carbon emissions. Carbon emissions are super important. They're definitely one of the major drivers, as we know, of climate change. There's a lot we can do to reduce carbon emissions. But if we're only looking at that, we have what's called the carbon tunnel vision, and we're missing out on all of these other factors of what it means to actually have sustainable computation and sustainable and just systems. So we need to, as technologists, also broaden our perspective on what we can and should do. So one model I want to introduce is called donut economics. I don't know if people are familiar with this donut economics already. So there's an economist, and she's won, I forget some notable economic prize about introducing this model. And what she does is talk about the fact that we have a mental model of a donut. inside the good juicy donut is this special zone where all of human life can thrive. We have the outside of the donut are the planetary boundaries. These are the things that we can't go beyond those boundaries, whether it's around biodiversity, whether it's around water usage, whether it's around air quality. All of these things give us the outside, the limits of what we can live on our planet. And then, interestingly, she talks about the inside, the kind of the floor, the bottom that we need, which is the social foundation. So we need to talk about how do we balance these planetary boundaries with the social foundation. That means everybody everywhere having access to education, housing, food, participation, these kinds of things. So how are we designing systems, or if we thought thinking about technology, how are we designing technical systems that work within planetary boundaries and provide a social foundation? Oops. So that was the donut model. Another model we're going to introduce is one we worked on at the Green Web Foundation. We call it consumption, intensity, and direction, or CID. And the idea with CID, or consumption, intensity, and direction, is that we have different variables when we're building something that we can ask, where are we taking action? So consumption is what I think a lot of things we've heard about today is around how do we reduce the technology we use or the impact of the technology that we're using. Intensity is around how can we make technology in a less harmful way. And direction, this goes back to those social ideas I was talking about and power ideas. What is the worldview we are accelerating by building this technology? So that sounds very abstract, but we have ways to think about that maybe more practically. If you're trying to implement it, there is, of course, a trade-off between the difficulty and the impact. It's much, much, much easier to just focus on reducing consumption. And that's definitely work that needs to be done, but it's easier. It's much, much harder if we're talking about like students just learning about IT to go into the workforce, to challenge their employers, try to get a job, stay employed, and make an impact in the world's largest, richest companies just in their space that they're able to program in. But how can we be changing the direction of the world, of the world that we're building? So these are just like lots of different ways you could start to look at it. I won't read them out loud, but they're kind of maybe prompts to think about how one might practically then start to think about things we could do around these three variables. Again, yeah, in consumption, those are quite straightforward. Around repair, we're avoiding overuse. And as you see, it kind of gets harder around even things like changing your job. Maybe your job is also part of the problem. And what can you do to be changing that? Yeah, that's kind of a lot, so I don't know what to do. We might just talk about it later. I want to acknowledge also that it's quite complex. It's also, as technologists, sometimes outside of our comfort zones. It's not easy in the spaces that we're given and the roles that we have in our organizations to actually talk about power. But it's something that's new and hard for everyone, and as citizens and humans on the planet, it's probably also tied to the necessity of making these conversations happen. And I think another speaker was talking about, there's also professional benefits, there's professional risks, of course, talking about these things, taking action in this way, but there's also a lot of benefits. We're seeing way more companies, researchers, organizations who are taking a stand on climate issues, and that actually is getting traction. People want that. People want to have this more sustainable and just digital future. And so we're seeing a lot of movement of capital, of interest of users to companies that are standing up for that. So it's hard, but we can do it. And we can also be open about what's working and what's not working, because it is a new field and there's it's unclear yet what the best practices will be. So lastly, to conclude, I wanted to share the work that we've been doing at the Green Web Foundation. We're based here in Berlin, at Oranienplatz. You can come visit us. We've been just sharing kind of three areas we've been working in. One is, so the organization has been around since 2006. It was set up in the Netherlands, and we have the world's largest open data set on which websites run on renewables or not. So you can put in a URL, and you can see, okay, is that running on renewables or not? And then through that, there's a path to kind of switch providers or make a request to your provider to run on renewables. So we receive over 200 million lookups a month on that data set. And that data set is now being used in things like the HTTP archive and web page test to actually talk about to make more visible how the internet is powered. We also do work to try to uplift and talk about these more systemic changes that are needed. So we make a magazine called Branch, which just won the Ars Electronica Prize 2 years ago, which is working more in a network to kind of uplift these examples. And we also tried to make the website itself carbon aware. So we worked with WordPress to basically when you load the page, it pulls real-time data around the energy mix of your current internet connection. So if your current connection is running on a lot of fossil fuels, we provide a very low data version of the website. It's just text. The images have been turned into just captions. And then as the energy grid is greener, in your current connection, you get to see more data. You get to see the higher res images and things like this. And the idea with making a kind of carbon aware website is to say, this is not a binary that either everything on or everything off, but rather how do we design more dynamic solutions and more carbon aware. So as more green energy is available, maybe we can make those kinds of adjustments. And that's also the beauty of the web, that you can have that sort of dynamicism. And then lastly, and maybe also what connects us to the Gesellschaft für Informatik is that we receive funding from the Internet Society Foundation and the Ford Foundation to run a fellowship program, which is a mix of technologists, journalists, other kinds of actors who are really working to bridge the digital rights and climate justice movements. Some are really working on technical projects, for example, in the WordPress community, or running their own solar-powered data centers, and others are working more at like a narrative or a legal level. Some other things that you might all find interesting is that one of the work we've been doing is with browser makers. So we just landed some code in Firefox. So if you go to Firefox now, they have a function called the profiler, and you can see each of the processes that are running now have not just the computation required, but also the estimated carbon emissions from that process is live now in Firefox. And we're talking to other browser makers about what it would take to ship that kind of, those kinds of carbon metrics. As I mentioned before, we're also working with different kinds of developer tools and developer sites like web page test, and in general trying to talk about how do we build these practices around like sustainable web design, sustainable development, web development into these tools that most developers are using to measure performance. And then lastly, we've been collaborating with actually two Berlin-based groups as well, WikiRate and Ecosia, around how we might start to link the data we have around which websites run on renewables to the climate pledges of those companies. And so that if you search, for example, Ecosia, this is a mock-up. I think they've done the kind of top 20 sites or something, that if you search Ecosia, put in things like Amazon, it'll not just give you results about Amazon, but it'll give you also data on the side. What's Amazon's climate pledge? How are they, what percentage of their infrastructure is running on renewables or not? I think these are ways we can start to make these systems more visible and work in an open source way to do it. So I guess lastly, something, and maybe also that's of interest to you all, is we've been working with how do we create these kinds of patterns that are trying to accelerate the internet and accelerate the transition of the internet off of fossil fuels. So some of the values we have is trying to, of course, work open source. We're small, we're like 5 people working out of an office in Berlin. We're small and scrappy. How are we going to change and shift big oil and big tech? Open source is definitely one of the tools we have to do that. Of course, as you know, because it's adaptable and can be scalable. Also to make things that are ready to use, we notice developers like to gravitate towards things that already exist. And we have to be wary, actually, that now this idea, this open washing is actually happening now with Shell, I think, has produced some green coding tools that are very well documented, very easy to use. And so this kind of idea that you would grab something that already exists is really powerful. And so how can we be creating tools that maybe have a different worldview than Shell's? And then lastly, yeah, we try to be as independent as possible, not take money from big oil and big tech, as well as trying to do work that's inspiring, not just filled with doom and gloom, but rather these are real things we could be doing now and today. Some maybe more conceptual things to explore that we're working on prototypes for that this group might find interesting is, one idea is around How do we shift computation across time and space so that we can go to the most greenest source? So one idea is that, maybe some of you have followed this, most data around how green your grid is looks at things on an annual basis. And the kind of gold standard is actually to talk about that on an hourly basis. So if we can actually get more data around the energy grid on an hourly basis, that helps us to shift computation to where it's greenest right now, not over the year and average, but happening right now. And through that, we could be maybe routing computation to those greener sources. Another idea we're working on is this idea of a walkable supply chain. How can, again, as I mentioned before, connect data sets around different parts of your digital supply chain and start to talk about the climate pledges and accountability of the companies that are providing things in your supply chain. As we know, digital supply chains are very complicated to figure out. And lastly, we're working with another group called Greenhost, based in the Netherlands, around this concept of a responsible cloud. So what does it look like to advocate for and build a cloud that's not just sustainable, but actually is doing things like protecting human rights and the other parts of the social foundation that are really important for society. So lastly, I guess if you're interested in, we have a developer documentation, developers.greenwebfoundation.org, where you can learn more about the JavaScript libraries we have, the APIs we have, and the data set. And yeah, if you have questions about who's using them or how to use them and all that, I can help a bit, and maybe also put you in contact with the documentation writer. So thank you very much, and look forward to your conversation.